Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the 1775 poems of the Johnson edition of the Poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to a little poem, number 20, Distrustful of the Gentian. The poem is going to bring to mind Gentian from poem 18, of course, this beautiful purple flower. And in some ways, we're going to consider this that returning back to poem 18 and a return to several other earlier poems that seem to celebrate the friend, the sister-in-law, and some call the lover of Emily Dickinson, Sue Gilbert Dickinson. This is an interesting poem because there's going to be a notable absence at line 5 that we're going to want to talk about as well. And there's been a lot of debate about this poem. Is it one poem? Is it two poems? And we'll kind of get into it as we go. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, our Chats with Emily is our playlist. And that especially that you have already studied with us the introductory lecture, as well as, I'm hopeful, the previous 19 poems. We just finished with Sepal. Now, the background information here is to simply point out that at times Emily loved to write love poems or friendship poems, however you wish to think of it, to Sue Gilbert Dickinson, that is to say her sister-in-law. So as we look at this poem, there's going to be a noticeable absence, a line that will provide a guessing game. And Emily loved to play these kind of games. So let's kind of play along. Now, Franklin, in his distinction here, or production or publishing of these poems, will produce poem 26 as the first stanza, poem 27 as the second stanza. I think this poem can be read as a single poem, or it can be read as separated. Let's read the poem. Distrustful of the gentian, and just to go away, the fluttering of her fringes chid my perfidy. Weary of my blank, I will singing go. I shall not feel the sleet, then I shall not fear the snow. Fleas sow the phantom meadow before the breathless bee. So bubble brooks in deserts on ears that dying lie. Burn so the evening spires to eyes that closing go. Hangs so distant heaven to a hand below. Now I want to begin with the word distrustful. Later it will be perfidy, of course, deceitfulness or distrustfulness of the Gentian. Now if we read this poem as the Gentian being Sue, Susie was Emily's favored name for Sue, then all of a sudden I think this poem starts to open up. Distrustful of Sue, and just to turn away. The fluttering of her fringes, the only other use of that word was back to poem 18, and we said that when we saw it there. Chid my perfidy. In other words, distrustfulness. In other words, there's always this tension that's going on in these, what we sometimes will refer to as the Susie poems or the Sue poems, where Emily is maybe distrustful of the relationship that she A, once had, and now B, maybe does not yet have with Sue. By the way, the use of perfidy is fascinating, and later we're going to see this in poem 1440, when she'll say it this way, to go its convalescent way, so shameless is to see, more generous were perfidy than such fidelity. And this tension between being deceitful versus being open and honest. And then notice this weary of my, and then there's a blank. Now a lot has been made of this blank. Some have argued that the word Susie fits rather nicely here to continue with the rhythm. So it's chid my perfidy, weary for my Susie. And then notice all the S sounds to follow. So it's almost like Emily's dropping breadcrumbs for us to tell us that Susie should be what is placed there in the dash. Now there are others who say she wrote the poem for potentially any number of potential friends or acquaintances or lovers, and so she puts it there. In other words, I'm weary. I long for my, in this case, we'll go ahead and imagine that it is Susie. I will singing go. In other words, I'm going to try to pretend like I'm not upset about this. I shall not feel the sleet. It's interesting that the word sleet could be a close resemblance to slight. Then I shall not fear the snow. In other words, I'm going to be okay, even though it's pretty obvious that I need to maybe feel a little bit distrustful of what's going on in regards to my pal. Now, Franklin would call that poem 26, and then the next poem 27. Here, Johnson will put them together. Fleas sow the phantom. Now, notice that we're having this use of the word sow, the simile here. The fleeing, the running away from me. This is kind of an attempt to describe what abandonment kind of feels like. Fleas sow the phantom meadow. We're going to see phantom at poems 346 and 354. And in both cases, they're kind of fascinating the way that they get used. Before the breathless bee. Notice here the repetition of the bee sounds. So bubble brooks in deserts. In other words, the thing that we most long to have with us sometimes is the thing we cannot have. It seems to kind of not want to be there. It kind of goes away. So bubble brooks in deserts on ears that dying lie. In other words, it's like knowing the water is just 20 more steps away, but you can't crawl 20 more steps because you've been in the desert so long you're dying. It's an amazing word picture, and Success is Counted Sweetest will play a similar game of someone who is unable to live any longer and yet will have the capacity to hear. Burn so the evening spires to eyes that closing go. It's fascinating. You know, there's sundown, you're going to the church, you can see kind of your marker of the spire of the church to know where to go, and then as the sun goes down you can't see it anymore. Hangs so distant heaven to a hand below. Now, when we meet poem 239, she's going to say, heaven is what I cannot reach. And there always seems to kind of be this tension for Emily. In other words, what is it that we're saying at 2a about this poem? Well, it's hard to live without the one that we cherish, yes? And so she's frustrated that she feels like she's never going to be able to have whoever the blank is representing in her life. And yet, it almost appears as if the one in that is the blank, let's say it's Susie, that she's maybe saying, stop worrying, everything is fine, everything is fine. At 2b, I love the similes at the conclusion of this poem, as Johnson will provide it for us in poem 20. At 3a, how can we relate this? Let's go back and return to John Donne's valediction forbidding mourning. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say the breath goes down, some say no. So let us melt and make no noise. You go back and look at our analysis of that at learnstrong.net. That's a poem that says, even though I have to be gone, we're still together and it's okay. That spirit, I think, is one that in some ways Emily's trying to channel here. Finally, at 3b, a way you can own a poem like this. What was a time that you struggled without having the one that you love or the one that you're friends with close to you? And to what degree does Emily celebrate that type of a challenge well for you? Thank you.